Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. It is a Ronin Katana RK series sword, a special sword to me because it's one of the swords that prompted my YouTube channel. But before I get into that, there's some disclaimers that I got to get out of the way. One, this is a review sample from Ronin Katana. It was sent to me for free, and if you think that makes me biased, then you know right at the beginning. Two, this is a scratch and dent sword, which means it may not be entirely representative of what you would expect to get if you were to buy one new. Hopefully it would have less flaws and be better than this one. And lastly, and probably most importantly, I'm not an expert or authority on swords or swordsmanship. I do study Japanese swordsmanship, but I'm not an expert. So keep that in mind as you hear my musings and ramblings. This review is just my thoughts, my personal take on it, and hopefully it's of value. Anyway, that's the disclaimers on with the actual reviewing. The best place to start is the cost. This is a $130 sword, which means it's an entry-level product, and my expectations are going to be gauged among other entry-level products. I can't hold it up to the same level as I would a sword that's multiple thousands of dollars or even hundreds of dollars, because this is not that. It's a $130 sword. At least that's the price right now. Depending on when you watch this, it may be more or less. You might find one on sale, or you might find one like this that's a scratch and dent and a little cheaper. Anyway, the point is, it's an inexpensive sword, all things considered. There are less expensive swords, but this one, it seems to be a pretty popular price category in the market overall, and we'll see if this one is worth your hard-earned money or not. Also, note that it says it's made of 1045 steel. Now, I say says because I have no way of personally validating it, but if that's the case, my understanding is that 1045 is a softer steel, making it easier to work with and helping keep the cost down. But it's also softer and means that it's more likely to take a set one way or the other and not spring back to shape after a bad cut. Being differentially hardened probably also adds to that. I don't know that I'm going to use this enough to really say if the differential hardening is going to help with edge retention. I suppose we'll find out later in the video, but a differentially hardened blade, while it comes with the aesthetic appeal of a hamon, which I'll show you later, it does also mean that it's probably going to bend relatively easily, and we'll see if my predictions are accurate. Anyway, I'm going to talk about the fit and finish now. Well, it's still in good condition. At this point in the review, I have not really cut anything. I've practiced with it actually quite a bit, but I haven't used it to actually cut anything, which is obviously its intended purpose. That said, at this point in the review, I haven't done that because I wanted to show you the sword while it's still in really good shape. Later in the review, obviously I'll get to cutting and eventually breaking it. Alright, I'm going to start with the kashira as I often do. That's a little butt cap, the pommel area here. And what I do want to point out is this is a mixture of good and bad casting. In a nutshell, what I can see is there are some kind of very fine casting bits here, and I can make out this detail, which is actually kind of surprising and good. This part right here doesn't have the same kind of crisp, clean lines, but under here, a lot of these little small kind of designed areas are somewhat intricate, and I can actually make out the detail in them, which is surprising. Oftentimes in fittings like this, it just gets muddy and ugly, and all of this kind of detail is obscured. But this is actually pretty crisp, all things considered. Now, having used this kashira, one thing I can say I don't like is this little ledge right here. Some of these shirodome are a little bit sharp, and they kind of rub on my hands in the wrong way. This little ledge right here in particular is what rests in my palm, and it's not... Something in here is biting me. Now, I'm probably going to just take a little file to it and sand it down ever so slightly. At $130, I suppose you might expect to have to do some degree of work, though I would hope that you wouldn't. Out of the box, it should be functional. And this ledge right here, I do find somewhat uncomfortable. Now, it hasn't made me bleed or cut me, but I would say I notice it while practicing, and it's something that I'm going to just sand down a little bit before I get into the real cutting side. Other bits to note, the transitions here, not bad. There's a slight ledge right here. I haven't noticed this biting me as much as the shirodome right here, but this little ledge bites me right here. Now, the shirodome are these little brass collars here. That's what I was noting earlier, but there's a slight ledge right here. And ideally, these are smooth and don't bite the user. It's minor and hasn't caused me any ill effect, but it's worth noting. Anyway, transitions are not bad. A lot of times they're really bunched up in this area, but the ito is somewhat loose in this area. The knot moves around a little bit. This one's a little tighter, but there's not ito kind of overlapping the kashira here, which means that it's not bunched up and it doesn't look too bad. If I move on to the ska, the handle, the grip area, one thing I want to note is that the ito is reasonably tight. Now, I can move it with pressure, but a lot of times these are exceptionally loose, and that is not the case here. This is serviceable. It's not my favorite. I would like it to be tighter, but for the cost, this is actually among the better and tighter itos that I've felt in this price point. Now, when I initially got this sword, there was a stain here, and that, I believe, was part of what made this a scratch and dent piece. It's worn away, though. I want to say there was some glue or residue here that created the stain, but after using it, kind of come away and I don't spot it anymore. The other bit you'll note is that there are some signs of usage here, and that's from me handling it. I've practiced with it quite a bit actually at this point, and cotton, I would say, degrades or shows signs of handling relatively quickly. That kind of adds to the kind of rough and tumble feeling, and I don't necessarily mind that in an inexpensive katana or even a more expensive katana. I like cotton ito, it's comfortable on the hands, and that has been my experience with this so far. Obviously I noted that something down here is rubbing on my palm, and that's not terribly comfortable, but the ito itself has been tight, serviceable, and overall relatively comfortable. It's starting to fray a little bit in some spots, not in a way that has caused it to loosen, but it does degrade, I think, as a material a little quicker. It's a little less expensive to use, so that kind of explains why it's on a less expensive sword. But honestly, I kind of like the rugged look that it leaves. It's not necessarily bad. Just note that that's the case. If you're expecting it to stay pristine over time, cotton is probably not the material you want to use, or at least not whatever cotton is being used here. The Sageo panels, I don't know if these are real or not. I suspect they are. And overall, the black lacquered pieces are pretty nice. I don't spot any large nodules or anything, but that doesn't that's not what I'm expecting in a sword of this price category. The menuki lack the same level of casting quality. They're not terrible, but they're a little muddier looking. They're gold and stand out. Thematically, I like how overall this sword looks. If I back the sword up to here, just aesthetically speaking, this kind of black and gold look is relatively classic to me. I like the way it looks. Nothing inherently pulls my eye one way or another. Just from an aesthetic perspective, I like the look of this particular model. The shape of the ska as well is not too axe-handly. It's relatively slender. My hands, it feels pretty comfortable on it. I have no real complaints. I'm kind of glad that the handle is the shape it is. These inexpensive swords have a tendency to kind of miss the mark. It's easy to index, but it's not too big for me to get my hands around, and it's comfortable overall to grip. If I move on to the fuchi, it has the same kind of pros and cons as the kashira. Transition-wise, it lines up pretty well. Transition-wise to the saya, it also lines up respectably well. Again, for a sword of this price point, there's nothing jutting or odd-looking. And the casting quality on here is overall quite good. I can make out these small little details here, but these larger pieces do look a little bit muddy. Again, for the price point, I'm not expecting a lot. Obviously, along this side, I can make out some kind of flattened spots where the little detail goes away. These are far from perfect, but for a $130 sword, I think they do offer something to appreciate. And I like this in particular. It's lined up actually quite well, and execution for a $130 sword is quite good here. The Tsuba, if you like this design, it's not one I'm particularly familiar with, but I like the overall look of it, certainly. None of these ledges feel sharp. It looks like there'd be a lot of little points to bite you, but none of them have, as I've rubbed my hand up against it or choked up against the Tsuba, caused me any discomfort in terms of usage. The reverse side of the Tsuba is equally bedazzled. You can see how it reflects in the gloss black saya. Overall, it's pretty from two directions. That brings me to Habaki, standard brass Habaki, nothing particularly special here. It fits on about as you would expect. Important note as I look here is that there's no ledges jutting out from the hamachi, moonmachi area. Sometimes they're just not fit and there's a ledge on either side and it's just not resting well. In this case, it seems to, for a $130 sword, be reasonably well fit. The other bit I want to talk about on the Habaki is that the tension on it seems about right. Now I can turn the sword upside down. A hard shake will kind of get it loose, but it takes a little bit. It pops out reasonably easy with my thumb. Tension-wise, this came out of the box perfect, better than most swords I get. Now adjusting that is easy, and I wouldn't expect the sword you get to necessarily be fit as well, but the fact that it came as well as it did, tensioned right, not just loose, not falling out. If I had to sand it a little bit, that wouldn't necessarily be a bother. I'm sure to loosen with time. This is kind of par for the course, but it hasn't really degraded in the while that I've been using it. And as I noted, I've used it a bit, and it's stayed pretty consistent. The other bit to note, saya-wise, is there's not a lot of rattle here. Sounds like it's rattling slightly in this area, but not around the tip, and that lends itself to gliding in and out of the saya reasonably well. It's noisy, but again, for the money, this is suitable for practice, and one thing that I thought was actually kind of nice. Now, if I twist it wrong, it will bind in spots in the saya, but overall, it's actually a pretty comfortable experience from a user perspective, saya-wise, and I'll show you that when I do a little movement of the blade. But from a user perspective for Iaido, it's comfortable. It's a little noisy, but for the money, it's certainly functional. The saya came with a simple black Sageo, was wrapped in a presentation knot around the kurikata area here. It's not cracked or broken. It's just simple paint though. It's not a horn piece. They're shirodome, and they haven't moved around. A lot of times when I untie the knot, these shirodome come loose. In this case, they've stayed in there, which is something I really like. They'll start rattling around and scratch the paint and stuff, so I like when they're glued on in such a way that they actually stay still. One thing that I do want to point out, though, is the kurigata is a little low by about 2 fingers. Now, ideally, this kurigata is right up here underneath my hand, so when I have it in my belt, which I'll show you later, it kind of sticks out a little bit more. Some people like a lower or higher kurigata, but I think this should be raised up a couple inches because it just doesn't rest well in my obi. It doesn't feel like it's sitting where it's supposed to be based on where this kurigata is placed. Other notes, the sai is a gloss black. It's held up pretty well. I've whacked the tip or the kojiri area into the ground a couple times. It hasn't really chipped, at least not that much. The gloss black is reasonably well, and you can see it's not necessarily full of ripples. Overall, it's reasonably well shaped. It doesn't thin out. It's one solid size, but overall, I'd have to say I like the saya. It's one of my favorites in the $130 range. It holds and it doesn't rattle extensively. The tension's right. This is one of my favorite parts of the sword, honestly, is just the saya that it came with and how well it fits. Now, one thing I'm less a fan of is the wax that Ronin puts on the swords, and it leaves residue. Now, I've cleaned the sword off a few times, but the wax, every time I pull the sword out and use it, it has some waxy residue on it. One thing I want to point out on the sword is something that just isn't there, and that is saya rub. Now, saya rub, when the swords often ship in the scabbard and they rattle around because the sayas don't always fit right. That's because the sayas and swords are produced separately, and it gets in a whole spiel. But suffice to say, many inexpensive production swords have isolated pockets of scuffs and scratches in the blade that you're just kind of resigned to getting. This one, because the saya was fit right, doesn't have those kind of unsightly spots in some areas. The polish, while it is a little lackluster given the price point and not as shiny as it could be, it's certainly as good as I would expect in a $130 sword. And the fact that it doesn't have these saya rub pockets is actually quite a treat. Now, whether or not you'll get one that does or doesn't is a different question. It's kind of an expectation that you will, but it's worth noting that this one, the saya was fit right, and as a result, the polish looks new. It doesn't have any imperfections that are worth noting. Now I'm going to show you the hamon. Hopefully my light is participating with me. I've tried to wipe off the wax. Now there is a hamon. The polish is kind of a satin polish. It's not as glossy as it could be, and as a result the hamon is a little tougher to see. But it's there, and it offers some aesthetic quality to appreciate. If you wanted to etch it and have the capability of doing that, then it would probably stand out a little bit more if you have polishing skills. There's something there to bring out and to appreciate if you have the time and aptitude to do it. The Kazaki has a Yokote kind of sanded on there. It's not burnished, but for a $130 sword, I'm not expecting anything more than that. At least the line is straight and clean. The bohi kind of terminates in a relatively simple way. One is, as you can see on this side, it's about a 1/4 inch or 1/8 of an inch below the Yokote, and over here it's touching, so they're not terminating in the same spot. It's more of a nitpick, but something I'm not a fan of. I like it when they terminate in the same spot. But there are some aesthetic things to appreciate there. Lines-wise, the sword is actually reasonably clean. Hopefully my camera is participating. The surfaces are not full of ripples. They're overall relatively flat, which makes me wonder. So this sword is $130 and has reasonably flat lines. The bohi wavers and ripples quite a bit more, but the surfaces of the steel are overall pretty flat. So if it can be achieved in a $130 sword, why is it that so many swords don't get it? I understand in European swords, different styles of manufacture and different techniques, but in a katana, why can you buy a $2,000 sword that's ripply all over the surfaces when it can be achieved in a $130 sword? Why? Anyway, I digress. The bohi shows a lot more tool markings. It's not polished as cleanly. The surface of the steel is not polished to a very high degree. But again, for a $130 sword, I think it offers quite a bit of character. I can make out the hamon slightly. The polish is satin. It's not as nice as it could be, but it still offers something to appreciate for the price point. Anyway, suffice to say, I think the blade has some aesthetic qualities that are admirable for the price point. Obviously, it's not as clean and pretty as it could be, but if you want cleaner and prettier, then more money is warranted. Also, if you have skill in polishing, the point is that I think you could bring it out. Some people have luck etching with lemon juice or using some other etchant material to bring out the details, or have some skill with sandpaper and can smooth out the surface and make it prettier. And if you wanted to do that, if you have the time, then at least there's something under there to appreciate and maybe justify the time you might spend on it. Sharpness-wise, this feels relatively sharp. I suppose I'm going to try cutting with the factory edge, and if it's insufficient, I will try to sharpen it. But at the moment, it feels sufficiently sharp. Shape-wise, it's pretty consistent with most of the shapes that are out there in swords of this price point. It has curvature pretty much right in the center of the blade. Tori-sori, I think, is what that's called, and overall it lends itself to being a light, lively blade. I will put descriptions and specifications and all of that in the description down below, along with a link to the weapon dynamics computer, which is a little tough. This is a rigid blade, so it's tough to find the nodes and all that, but I'll try to include all that in the description down below. A couple of comments on the sword as you see me moving it around. First off, this sword is 2 pounds 3-ish ounces. To me, that puts it in the kind of light to medium light category. I would say 2.8 pounds is somewhere in the medium to medium heavy. Under 2 pounds would be on the lighter side, so it's somewhere in the medium range. And honestly, it moves around just as I would expect kind of a medium light blade to have. It has presence, but not too much. Hopefully the weapon dynamics computer provides some insight that maybe my words are not. But the other things that I can maybe convey outside of the raw data are that it feels very comfortable. The ito doesn't move around in my hand. I do feel a slight motion of the nikago rattling in the scot, not extensively. I have to have the sword in pretty hefty motion, but I do feel it. Overall, though, it's a very comfortable sword. It draws well, it sheathes well, it comes out, it makes a nice asuji or wind sound as I move it if my edge alignment is good, which it certainly always isn't. But the point is, I would say, as a user piece, as an Iaido practitioner type piece, it's relatively nice for a sword in this price point. I'm not expecting a lot, and I think I'm getting more than really is bargained for it at the price point. I would struggle to find an Iaito, a dull blade specifically for this purpose that would function better. So honestly, even if you're thinking about dulling the blade just to use it as an Iaito, it's a comfortable thing. But then again, you would have to deal with cleaning it, where you would scratch that thought. Point is, dynamically speaking, it works pretty well.
See if we can, just a little bit. Close call, trying to go too fast. Not skilled enough to go that fast with a sharp sword. You can see it's starting to rub on my hand from right in this area. This little nubbin right here, this rubbing right here. You also see the wax buildup here.
Alright, sword friends, while the experience is fresh in my mind, I'm going to recap my initial impressions of cutting as well as the round of Iaido that I did. So again, not the first time I've done Iaido with the sword, but certainly the first time I've cut with the sword, as I noted. So in doing Iaido, it might be the temperature, but I noticed that I felt the handle wiggling around. I felt the Nakago wiggling in my hand just a little bit. And as I'm inside and the temperature's cooled down and I brought all my equipment in from recording, I don't feel it anymore. I don't feel it rattling, but initially I was feeling some amount of rattling in here, and it's probably due to the temperature. It's very humid and hot outside, at least it is for me, and I set the sword out in the sun while I was setting up to record, so it may have gotten warmer, and now it's been inside for a while, and it's cooled off. I had to clean up, and so the sword got to cool down before I did, but I don't notice the movement in the handle at all. That's something I think I could shim, but something worth noting that I did feel it moving around, in the Nakago moving around inside the handle a little bit doing Iaido. Not a lot, but worth noting. Overall, the main irritation seemed to really be the wax buildup. That was, again, it got to warm up, but the wax would still show up on the sword. I'd have to clean it off. It was just an irritation. I feel it as I go to put the sword away. I went a little fast, cut myself just a little bit, not a lot. So it is certainly sharp all the way at the tip here. But overall, it's honestly a very fun training tool. As a user tool for $130 to practice with a sword like this, it kind of checks most of the boxes that you would need as a starting off student that wants to practice with a sharp sword. It's light enough to do repetitions with, and I'll include specs and weights and all of that in the description down below, along with the weapon dynamics computer. But it was comfortable. It draws. It's a little noisy on the draw, but for $130, the fact that the saya fits, doesn't rattle, the tension's about right, and that it that you can do no-toe reasonably well with it is a treat. I didn't shave this thing down yet. I should, and it did cause a little bit of wear. I'm not bleeding, but it was uncomfortable to use. The palm hitting this little metal bit down here was uncomfortable. But that's about it. As in terms of functionality, in terms of general using, it was pretty fun. In terms of cutting, actually surprised. The edge feels sharp. I thought maybe I would have to hone it a little bit, but it did cut the pool noodles, which not all swords do. It takes a good edge and a reasonable edge alignment, and sometimes more than that. Pool noodles can be a deceptively challenging target to cut, but it moved through them. The edge feels like it could be sharper, but honestly I don't know that I need it to be. Out of the box, it cut the pool noodles. It could cut a little more laser-like, granted, and with a keener edge I imagine it would, but it cut sufficiently. The milk jug, I don't have a ton of water bottles at the moment to use. I cut up all my cream containers in the last sword review that I did. But it cut reasonably well. It didn't look like it was tearing the paper. It overall cut just fine. And then I moved on to Japanese tatami mat. Now the tatami mats that I used are used Japanese tatami mats. They're a little harder. They have oils from people's feet and all of that kind of stuff. And it was soaked for a while, so it's a pretty tough tatami mat to cut. I say that because there are varying types of tatami mats, and the used Japanese tatami mats tend to be more hard or a denser target to cut. Anyway, suffice to say, it seemed to work really well. It was reasonably forgiving. I didn't have a lot of really bad cuts, but my edge alignment was certainly not spot on, and the sword is still straight. I kind of expected a little slight bend somewhere, but I don't see one at all in the sword right now. Overall, it held up really well. It cut really well. I was able to do some of the upward kind of diagonal cuts, and overall, it did the job remarkably well. I was reasonably impressed with the overall cutting performance of the sword. Now, sharper edge would probably help out a little bit more, but it is certainly sufficient out of the box to do the job. And I think that's kind of the main point, is I think of who the market for $130 sword might be. It could be just because you like it, and if that's the case, fine, buy it. It's a fine sword. But if you're looking for an entry-level tool to start cutting, and you want the hamon and the aesthetic of it, overall, this seems to check most of the boxes that I would say are a requirement for an initial training tool, and it certainly did the job out of the box. Now, is it the most geared for tatami? No, certainly not. But as you can see, it did the job okay. Anyway, those are my initial thoughts. At this point in the review, I am going to move on to more abusive things. So the sword did what it was supposed to do from an initial cutting standpoint. I was able to cut pool noodles, cut water bottles, cut tatami mats, and obviously I haven't cut thousands or hundreds of them, and I don't really have a way to replicate that. The handle has held up, and over the course of the last few weeks I've used this sword quite a bit, and it's held up. But again, this is not years of sustained usage, though overall it shows promise to hold up for that kind of thing, and be at a price point where you can kind of justify maybe buying a sharpening stone or doing some of the cleanup work yourself. Suffice to say though, I think for an initial impression, overall cutting, it did the job pretty well. I'm happy with it, and I think it does the things that it's supposed to do. In the destruction part, I'll move on to that. I'm going to cut targets at this point though that are, for the most part, destructive, and I'm trying to abuse the sword going forward. So I'm kind of expecting it to bend, and I'm going to evaluate what happens in the remaining cuts. I'm going to take it to progressively harder targets, and in each case, I'm going to kind of look at it and see what kind of damage to sustain. Now, my hope is that it goes a very long way before it breaks in half or becomes unusable or unsafe to use. But I guess I don't know. Anyway, at this point, note, abuse is coming.
I don't see any bends in the sword. See if I can make it straight. Not seeing any bends, which is good. I don't see anything bad about the edge. Cut better. I whacked the stand, which is what I was trying not to do. So it hurt good. Nothing to pay. Oh, worth noting, I seem to have chopped through the bamboo. I forgot my other peg is there, my oak dowel. Looks like it made it a couple millimeters in. Okay. Not a bad response overall. Where did I get the bamboo, you ask? Well, I had a tiki torch with bamboo stem on it. That's what I ended up using, was from a tiki torch. Reasonably clean cuts. Not seeing any edge deformation at this time. It still feels, I want to say, about as sharp as it did before. Sharpness wise in the gloves, but all right. Not sure if you're able to see this, but after the cutting, I'm able to see a slight warp or a slight bend about here in the blade. And also these marks on here are from me doing the dynamics computer and marking the areas as I notice kind of the points and yada yada. Anyway, I digress. Point is, I'm starting to notice a bend in the blade at this point. It looks like there might be chunks of aluminum or stuff stuck to it, but oh, maybe there's something here. Yeah. So right on the tip here, you make out some very minor, something stuck to it, so there's some sort of burr, but very minor damage. Lots of fun there. We can see that sword got a little dirty, has a different color now. But we also have some pretty hefty edge damage. I'll zoom in on here, but I do see some damage cutting into the top of the can. This looks like where I struck it. I'm not sure where I struck it the second time. Maybe in the same spot. But here we go. Zooming up here, you can see that the edge has taken some damage. Looks like chunks of it have chipped off, as I would expect on a differentially hardened edge. I don't see a lot of rolling. It looks like just the finest part of the edge has chipped away. Computer disassembly. This caused quite a bit of deeper damage here. We can see a pretty significant ding. A little more burny. Significant chipping. Some obvious dulling. Actually not as bad as I guess I would expect. I can kind of see that this is where I whacked the brick. Not a particularly hard brick, but it's also hitting the metal or the wooden stand underneath. Holding up pretty well. Also want to point out, the sword has still got a little bit of bend in it from where it did before, but it's preserved its shape. It's not canted at all. Fittings. Well, I can feel a slight. No, that's my hand moving. Very mild bit of Tsuba wiggle. I feel about as much rattle in the handle, well, maybe a little bit more, but all in all, these things are pretty minor. It's gone through some punishment. It's still holding up and working pretty well. Pass the guard strike. Obviously, not a terribly sufficient test. But you can see where I'm using my sword to kind of knock the other out of the way. It's causing dings in the blade, but it's still straight. Granted, they're not holding it as, the stand isn't holding it as hard as a person would, but holding up. Got a pretty big ding here. In the bind, look at what happens. You can hook the sword and move it around quite a bit. It's starting to look like a saw, but still holding together. Also want to point out, it's still in about the right shape. I was honestly expecting this to take a deeper set, to bend quite a bit more. It hasn't done that. Will it bend? Watch this. Yes. It'll bend very easy. Against a stationary object. Gonna bend it back. Yes. Bad strike. All right. The audio's going to pan out here, but one thing I want to point out is you can see that the sword has started to straighten. This curve is no longer following the sword. It started to curve up. So I'm going to turn it around. I'm going to hit it on the spine. Expectation is that it's going to break in half pretty quickly. It's an interesting grain pattern here. It looks very tight along the edge. The grain looks a little bit large. The outer jacket looks like a different material almost. I guess I'm not sure what to make of this, but you metallurgists out there might know more. To me, this looks pretty good though. Sword is broken. I will recap some other thoughts, but some things to keep in mind. There is a little bit of a wiggle in the tang area. The kashira has come off, but it hasn't come off, it's come loose. It's still in a salvageable point where a bit of a glue or epoxy or something like that, to some sort of adhesive on here would hold this on. I'll take the ska apart and we'll see how it looks when it's all done here, but it actually held up pretty well to some of those obviously very punishing blows. I'll recap final thoughts when I have them.
All right, sword friends, so I'm going to recap the ska and how well this bit held up before I get to the blade. The basic gist is the kashira came loose. That's about the only thing that I really noticed, apart from some rattling inside here. That means that the tang of the blade was kind of bouncing around ever so slightly. I felt it, but not necessarily in a way that gave me pause or caution or made me want to stop or made me think it was unsafe. So in this case, though, it'd be able to be fixed with a bit of Gorilla Glue. This happens pretty commonly on swords I use for iaido. If I'm practicing, you'll notice even in cutting, you kind of do this motion to check and see if your kashira is still there. These coming off is common. This doesn't look like it's filled with resin or any kind of nasty goop or anything like that, so I suppose that much is a good sign. And the only other thing I noticed was the handle rattling around, or rather the tang rattling slightly inside the handle. Not in a way that gave me pause or made me think it was unsafe, but worth again noting. It did get a little worse after some of the really bad percussive stuff, but not honestly that bad. Other bit I want to know is I pulled the mikugi out and I noticed that they were stained black or painted black or something like that. It's a small thing, but it keeps them from having kind of white dots here, or wooden colored or bamboo colored dots. So it's a small addition, a small thing, but it goes a long way in adding to the aesthetic, I think. The fuchi area here, this comes off. It's also worth noting that the ska came off really easy. I pushed the mikugi out with a bamboo peg. I didn't have to use a hammer, and then I was able to slide the ska off. It wasn't bad at all. Now on the back here, I can notice that the seam has opened up, so this is often just kind of glued together. It's made from two flats, so this is not a crack exactly, but it is also more open, I suppose, than it should be. Along here, it also looks like it's made with 3 pieces. Well, I don't think it's made with 3 pieces. Anyway, the seam along the back looks like it has opened, but I don't notice any pronounced cracking along the sides or back. It just looks like this seam has opened. Turn it upside down, give it a little tap. There's some dust and stuff that's coming out of here, but nothing grotesque or super bad. No huge chunks or paper or anything like that. And you can also make out how the skin is applied here. Honestly, not bad. It held up. It's not broken in half. This I would say was actually quite good. This is a little odd, I would say, how the cutout is done on the fuchi. It looks bigger and not as nice as it could be. This should just be modeling the Nakago Ana, the space that the Nakago goes in, but it's obviously much larger. I imagine it saves a little bit of time if it's done this way, but nevertheless, most people probably don't see this part. A couple quick notes about the Nakago. The Nakago is just nothing special, and it shouldn't be in a sword of this price point. $130 doesn't buy you a lot of time, and a lot of customers are never going to disassemble the sword and never see this part. So I can imagine it's not really worth investing a lot of time and energy because the customer isn't likely willing to pay for it in this price point. Now, could it be better? Absolutely. Would a better price justify it? Probably. In a nutshell, though, there's no kind of file markings in a decorative way. I think that's called usurime, or a file pattern that's applied to the Nakago. It's pretty rough in shape. There's some pointy bits and some sanding marks and tool marking on here that is unsightly. There's no signature. There's burrs that are left on this, but functionally speaking, it fit the ska, the handle, the grip really well, and I was able to take the mikugi out, and I didn't have to pound on this thing with a hammer to take it apart. The handle slid off. Granted, it's after some use, so it's probably loosened up a little bit, but very often I have to pound these things off with a hammer, and this came off reasonably well. I would say reasonably well in the sense of a practitioner. If I wanted to take this apart to clean it, to service it, to kind of futz around with it as you often do as par for the course with Japanese style swords, I was able to do that effectively and easily without having to use percussive maintenance, if you will. So it really exceeds my expectation from a fit and finish standpoint. Well, maybe not the finish standpoint, but a fit standpoint. Again, being able to slide the ska on and off and having the pins come out and not having to use a hammer or beat on it or diminish the condition in order to take it apart to clean it is quite a good thing. Now, this one isn't worth cleaning anymore. It's broken, but I would say that fit level exceeds my expectations. The finish is obviously pretty bare bones and is what I would expect. There's nothing rat-taily or nasty or gnarly or terrible about this, other than it's just very, very cheaply made because it's a relatively inexpensive sword. All right, I want to do a quick recap of the abusive portion of the testing. So first, I cut a used Japanese tatami mat with a bamboo core in it. Granted, it was a bamboo core from a tiki torch, so it's probably not that durable, but nevertheless, a wooden core. I didn't notice any difference really cutting that to cutting the just tatami mat by itself. It cut really well, and it didn't take a set. I had some not great cuts in there, and it did it actually pretty well. And it also cut the hardwood and didn't bend very easily. When it did eventually bend, granted later on in the test, I was able to straighten it by kind of smacking it on the side, and I suppose that just kind of goes to show the resilience. If the blade did bend in a use scenario, you might be able to give it a smack on something, have it straighten out, and still continue using it as a functional object. Other than that, like, it didn't bend or chip or do anything bad during the wooden cutting, I suppose I would say. And in that, I mean, I was cutting hardwood, I was doing some bad cuts, I was throwing a lot of gusto, and it took a lot before the blade took a slight bend. Obviously, when I intentionally bent it, it got worse. The edge didn't deform, at least in any kind of notable way on the wood. It took cutting the aluminum cans, and even then I didn't see it. After I did that, the other metal objects started to gradually degrade the blade in worse and worse and more severe ways, until naturally the result, it chipped the edge significantly, flipped it on the back, and started hitting the back with a lot of force. That caused one of these cracks to open up, and or caused it to open up a larger crack and break. And there's another crack forming here. Overall, though, I would say, resilience-wise, in terms of durability, the sword really surprised me. It's a lively, light little blade. Well, not super light, but relatively lively in the hand, and I would have expected it to bend easier, and I would have expected it to break sooner. So I'm actually pretty impressed with the overall resilience and ability of this blade straight out of the box for the price point again. Alright, sword friends, now's the part of the review where I answer the question, do I personally think the sword is worth it or not? And honestly, this is the easiest yes I could throw out. So short answer, yes. Long-winded answer, if the long-winded video you've already watched isn't sufficiently answered that question for you. Dynamically, it's a fun sword to move around. You have the weapon dynamics computer, you have my thoughts, but basically it's a nice, nimble, reasonably well-balanced sword, especially given the price point. And I'll talk on that in just a moment. Dynamically speaking, fun. In terms of cutting, it did the job sufficiently out of the gate. It could have a sharper edge, but honestly, in swords of this price point, a lot of people have to resign themselves to doing some work out of the gate, and I didn't have to in order to cut the targets I was cutting. It actually did a pretty serviceable job on used Japanese tatami, which is really my target of choice and what I try to learn and grow on more than any other target. So it did the job, and it held up really well, even in tatami with a bamboo core and my bad angles and my bad technique. It certainly did the job. In terms of destruction, I think it held up really well to the test that I put out there. I think the damage that it had and basically how it gradually degraded until it failed was more than reasonable for, again, a sword of this price point, and really a sword beyond this price point. I think it held up remarkably well. It proved that it didn't have any critical flaws or major problems that would cause it to be a helicopter of death, and it proved to be quite resilient. So yes, I think in short the sword is certainly worth it. I could see it being a great sword for somebody that wants to practice EI or do Japanese martial arts, because again, it checks more of those user requirement boxes than it misses. The sire retention was right, how it drawed was a little noisy, but overall it was a really comfortable student practice blade to use. There are obviously blades made to cut tatami specifically better. I know I said that word kind of weird, but there are better blades to cut tatami specifically if that's all you're doing. But a lot of people don't have more than $130 to spend on a sword, and they want something that's going to be comfortable for EI, something that's going to be able to do the job with the tatami, and I think this is going to do that. Also, at a price point, I think it's pretty feature rich. It provided some also inexpensive expertise. If you're a person that just wants to experiment, do some generic stuff with a sword, and you don't want to risk your $500, your multiple thousands of dollar blades, then this is a good example of a sword that feels good and at the same time holds up pretty well, and you don't have to feel as bad about if it degrades or is damaged. And if you only have $130 to spend on a sword, I think you get a lot for your money in this particular product. So those are my thoughts. Hopefully the video provides you with all the information you need to decide if a sword like this is worth your hard-earned money or not. But for me, I certainly think it is. And also, it holds a special place in my heart. The RK Series blade is where I started my YouTube channel. It's the first video that I put out. It's the first review that I did, and I wanted to do it again. I wanted to go back to square one and try again because I think I've gotten better at this. So special thanks to Ronin Katana for sending me this review sample. Really appreciate it. Hopefully the review is better and adds a bit of missing information that the first one did not have. That's all I've got for you. As always, cheers, and thanks for watching.